Hello and welcome. If you're new here, my name is Kate and my channel is dedicated to exploring the fascinating lives and legacy of the Bronte family. Whether you're a lifelong Bronte fan or just starting to discover their world, you've come to the right place. So today we're focusing on the two sisters you may not have heard of, Maria and Elizabeth Bronte. They were the older sisters of the famous Bronte authors Charlotte, Emily and Anne, and of course Branwell's there as well. While Charlotte, Emily and Anne's names are sort of well known, Maria and Elizabeth's stories are often overlooked, but their short lives and untimely death plays a significant role in shaping the family, particularly the lives of the surviving siblings. 2025 marks the 200th anniversary of their deaths, and I wanted to take this opportunity to honour their memory. In this video, we'll explore their early lives, their education, and the profound impact their deaths had on their family, especially their father, Patrick Bronte. Though they didn't live long enough to write their own stories, Maria and Elizabeth's lives are integral to understanding the Bronte family's history and, of course, their legacy. Maria Bronte was born in 1814, although the exact date of her birth isn't recorded, but people often use her christening date as her birth date. She was baptised on April the 23rd, which is St George's Day, at St Peter's Church in Hartshead by William Morgan. It's likely that the Morgans, alongside the Fennel family, served as her godparents. Maria was the eldest child of Patrick and Maria Branwell Bronte, her mother, and as the firstborn, she naturally held that special place in the Bronte family. Elizabeth Bronte was born on the 8th of February 1815, about a year after Maria, and was named after her mother's sister, Elizabeth Branwell, who was also her godmother. Elizabeth's other godparents were John Schofield Firth and his daughter Elizabeth Firth, who lived at Kipling House in Thornton. Elizabeth was baptised by John Fennel on the 26th of August 1815, nearly 7 months after her birth, which is quite late for the standards of the day. Also, looking at the dates, it's likely that Maria, the mother, was pregnant with Charlotte at the time of Elizabeth's christening. From an early age, Maria and Elizabeth were surrounded by a wealth of intellectual stimulation. The Brontes family, despite their modest means, had access to Patrick Bronte's extensive book collection, which, as we know, played a significant role in shaping the girls' intellectual development. Patrick encouraged his children to read widely, instilling in them a deep love of learning and faith, and believed strongly in the values of education and religious faith. These values were woven into the fabric of their upbringing. As the girls grew older, they were sent to Crofton Hall, a school in Wakefield that was recommended by Elizabeth Firth. She had attended the school herself as a child. The exact date of their time at Crofton Hall is not known, but it's likely a brief stay, as it was an expense Patrick could ill afford. The girls were still quite young at this time. Martha was only 9 years old and Elizabeth just 8. However, their formal schooling would have been an important step in their education. Patrick Bronte described Maria and Elizabeth as very different but complementary. He said, "Maria has a powerful intellectual mind. Elizabeth had good solid sense." These qualities, along with the grounding they received at Crofton Hall, would have stood them in good stead as they moved forward in their education. However, the cost of the school was a strain on the family, and it seems that the girls' godparents may have actually helped contribute to their expenses. Their time at Crofton Hall was relatively short, as Patrick was already looking at other educational opportunities. On the 4th of December 1823, an advertisement for a new school appeared in the Leeds Intelligencer. This advertisement was likely seen by Patrick as an answer to his prayers. The school, called Cowan Bridge, was to open in March or April of the following year, and it was described as a school for clergymen's daughters and promised a well-rounded education for the girls at an affordable rate. Perfect. The school headline read, The house will be enlarged and altered for the accommodation of 60 pupils. Each girl is to pay £14 a year, half in advance, for clothing, lodging, boarding and education, and £1 entrance towards the expense of books, etc. This affordable education was particularly appealing to Patrick, who was supporting a growing family on a clergyman's salary. The school was aimed at girls from clergyman families throughout the country, with an emphasis on intellectual and religious improvement, as well as preparing the girls for respectable roles in life, including teaching and governess positions. This educational philosophy aligned with the evangelical values of the time. Despite the cost, the Bronte girls' time at Crofton Hall marked an important moment in their educational journey, but it was their time at Cowan Bridge that would have a far greater impact on their lives and, of course, their futures. Oh, sun's come out, which obviously is giving me a horrible shadow. Excuse that. It's just nice to be in the sun, isn't it? Drying everything out a bit. Yes, one glove on, one glove off. I can't work the camera with my gloves on, so I might as well have one warm hand, eh? It's chilly. It's chilly. Hence hat. Hope you like it. I love a hat. If you don't already know, any opportunity to put a bonnet on. I wish it was a bonnet, you know, a proper Charlotte and Emily bonnet. That would be amazing, wouldn't it? I think I might want to do that one day. Wear traditional clothes with a proper bonnet. Anyway, I love to wear a hat. Don't know why. Any opportunity to put a hat on. Right. Waffling. Haven't done that for a while, have I? A proper waffle. Right, let's get going. In 1824, Maria and Elizabeth Brontë were sent to Cowan Bridge School, a boarding school for daughters of clergymen located about 45 miles away from their home in Haworth. The school had only been open for a few months when the Brontës arrived, and although it was capable of accommodating up to 60 odd girls, there was never that many students during their time there. Maria and Elizabeth was only the 17th and 18th pupil to attend, and by the time their younger sisters, Charlotte and Emily, were withdrawn on the 1st of June in 1825, only 53 pupils were registered at the school. The school was intended to offer an education for girls in a religious setting, but the conditions were far from ideal. The girls were expected to attend Sunday service at Tunstall Church, a 2-mile walk across the fields from the school, no matter what conditions, where Wilson, the vicar, would preach. However, the daily life at the school was far from the nurturing environment one might expect from an educational institution. Charlotte Brontë later described the food at Cowan Bridge as spoilt by the dirty cleanliness of the cook, making it so unappealing that she and her sisters disliked their meals exceedingly. According to a fellow student, Maria Gauntlet, the dinners were sufficient but not good. 3 days a week the girls were served with what they referred to as hot pot, or a potato pie. A dish consisted of pieces of meat, fat, and potatoes, often poorly prepared. On the other 2 days they were given salt beef, which was often ill-cured, and on the remaining days they had either beef or veal, with mutton rarely seen on the menu. The living conditions at Cowan Bridge were harsh, and the health of the students suffered as a result. Of the 53 pupils at the school during the time of the Brontës' attendance, 1 girl died there, 11 others left due to ill health, with 6 passing away shortly after returning home. In the first 9 months of 1825, a particularly alarming period for them, 20 girls were withdrawn from the school, including Maria and Elizabeth, and of these 9 were in ill health. The Brontë sisters' health began to deteriorate whilst at the school, but like many others, they did not write home about the conditions they were enduring. It's unclear whether they were afraid to complain or whether they simply didn't realise the extent of the mistreatment at the time. Regardless, their silence speaks to the oppressive nature that they endured. Academically, the Brontë sisters fared poor at Cowan Bridge. Their acquirements venturing were listed as unimpressive by the standards of the time. Maria, aged 10, was recorded as reading tolerably, writing pretty well, but struggling with ciphering, arithmetic, and plain sewing. She knew a little of grammar, but very little of geography and history. She'd made some progress in reading French, though she knew nothing of the language grammatically. Elizabeth, aged 9, fared even worse, with the record stating that she read little, wrote pretty well, but ciphering none, and had no knowledge of grammar, geography, history, or accomplishments such as French music or drawing. Despite these academic challenges, the conditions at the school were the prime factor in the Brontë sisters' early departure. Maria and Elizabeth were sent home in April 1825 after only a year. By then, their health had already been severely affected. Charlotte and Emily Brontë returned home 2 months later. They were not suffering from illness at the time, but the family likely decided to remove them from the school due to the poor conditions that contributed to the deteriorating health of Elizabeth and Maria. Imagine if all the graves could hear me. They're all sitting there going, "Oh, this is quite interesting. I didn't know this." Or, "Oh, isn't it nice to have someone talk to us?" So I'm just going a bit mad now. Right. Maria and Elizabeth Bronte's time at Cowan Bridge had a devastating impact on their health. The harsh conditions at the school, coupled with the poor diet and inadequate care, set the stage for a rapid decline in both girls' physical well-being. We might think it strange that they never wrote home about their treatment, but this was kind of typical in the Victorian era. They sort of adhered to this ethos of silence and decorum, and never complaining about the conditions that they endured. Charlotte later recalled that neither Maria or Elizabeth never spoke of the grim realities of Cowan Bridge, likely out of a sense of propriety and in an unspoken belief that it was improper to voice grievances. By the spring of 1825, after returning home from Cowan Bridge, Maria's condition had become increasingly severe. She was suffering from consumption, what we now know is TB or tuberculosis, which was common in the damp, poorly heated conditions of the school. Consumption affects the lungs and it causes this debilitating symptoms such as coughing, chest pain, weakness and of course fever. It is likely that Maria's already fragile health, compromised by her time at Cowan Bridge, made her particularly vulnerable to this illness. She became gravely ill, and despite the efforts to care for her, Maria died on the 6th of May 1825, just a few months after returning home. Elizabeth, though not as severely affected by the conditions at Cowan Bridge, was deeply impacted by the loss of her sister. The grief of losing Maria took a heavy toll on Elizabeth's own health, which had already been weakened by the harsh conditions at school. It is likely that the emotional strain of the loss, coupled with the physical effects of the illness that she'd contracted, contributed to her own rapid decline. Elizabeth passed away on the 18th of June 1825, just 6 weeks after Maria's death. The timing of her passing made it all that more tragic, as she had only just begun to process the loss of her sister before she too succumbed to the illness. The funerals for both girls took place at St Michael's and All Angels Church in Haworth, where their father, Patrick Bronte, had preached his sermons every week there. Patrick, though deeply grieved, did not conduct the service, and it was overseen by the curate, William Morgan, who had also been responsible for Maria's baptism what only felt like a few years before. The entire Bronte family, including the children, Charlotte, Emily and Branwell, attended the funeral to mourn the loss of Maria and Elizabeth. Their bodies were laid to rest in the family vault at Haworth Church beside their mother, Maria Branwell Bronte, who had died 4 years earlier in 1821. God, I've got a lump in my throat now. The death of Maria and Elizabeth Bronte had a profound and lasting impact on the Bronte family, particularly on Charlotte and Emily, who had both been very close to their sisters. For Charlotte, the loss was devastating, leaving an emotional void that she would never fully recover from. She'd been particularly close to Maria, and the depth of her grief is evident in the letters she wrote later in her life. In one letter, she confessed, "I felt like half of me had been taken away." Maria's death in particular left Charlotte struggling with an immense sense of loss and deep sorrow. This grief marked a turning point in Charlotte's life, and her emotional pain became a central theme in her writing. The themes of loss, grief, and the fragility of life are reoccurring topics in many of her novels. The death of her sisters likely influenced the way she wrote about the emotional toll of death in the characters' lives. For instance, in Jane Eyre, the death of Jane's loved ones reflects a deep sense of personal loss. And in Shirley, the characters experience similar suffering, mirroring Charlotte's own emotional turmoil. As she later wrote in her letter, her grief made me know my own heart better. Emily, though equally affected, expressed her sorrow more quietly and privately. However, the grief she felt undoubtedly found an outlet in her writing. In Wuthering Heights, the theme of death, longing and emotional connections are deeply embodied in the characters' relationship. The intense passion between Cathy and Heathcliff could be seen as a reflection of Emily's own inner turmoil. Emily did not often express her grief openly, but through her writing, she poured out her complex emotions surrounding loss. Branwell Bronte's grief over the death of his older sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, was deeply felt, though it didn't always come through in his writing. While his poems often explored themes of loss and melancholy, Branwell did not explicitly focus on his sister's death. Instead, his writing reflects a more sort of general sense of disillusionment and emotional struggle, which may have been shaped by his early family tragedies. His grief likely influenced his inner turmoil and complicated feelings about his future, which were evident in both his personal life and, of course, his creative work. Anne, who was much younger when Maria and Elizabeth died, also experienced their death profoundly. While she was not as directly affected by the loss in the same way as, say, Charlotte or Emily, she did witness the emotional toll it took on her family. Anne was more of a reserved figure, and the death of her sister may have contributed to her thoughtful and introspective nature. Her later writings, such as Agnes Grey, reflect themes of resilience and inner strength, which could have been influenced by the challenging family circumstances that she experienced whilst growing up. Overall, the loss of Maria and Elizabeth left an integral mark on all the surviving Brontë siblings. Charlotte, Emily, Branwell and Anne each handled the death in their own way, but all were marked by the absence of their two sisters. The grief from their death shaped not only their personal lives, but also their literary work, where loss and its emotional consequences remain central themes. Patrick Bronte, the father of the Brontë children, was deeply affected by the death of Maria and Elizabeth, of course. A man of strong religious faith, Patrick sought the solace in his belief, often turning to prayer and reflection to cope with the immense loss. Despite this, the emotional toll of losing two of his beloved daughters was overwhelming, and his grief was profound. Maria, in particular, had been Patrick's favourite, and he frequently expressed his sorrow over her death. In a letter to Charlotte, he reflected on the loss, saying, "I shall never be the same man again after Maria's death." The weight of this sorrow affected not just his emotional state, but his whole outlook on life. His grief shaped his relationship with his surviving children, especially Charlotte, to whom he often turned for comfort. In September 1825, Patrick received the final settlement from Cowan Bridge School. And in a long letter of condolence from the school superintendent, Miss Evans, the letter expressed sympathy for his loss and described how the school had not fully recovered from the outbreak of TB earlier that year. Miss Evans wrote that despite the tragedy, they were able to look to the future with hope, finding comfort in their religious faith. Her letter concluded with the wishes for peace and salvation, though it lacked any acknowledgement of the connection between the school's condition and the death of Maria and Elizabeth. Can you believe that? Patrick was credited £2, 14 shillings and 2p from the settlement, a small amount compared to the £80, 2 shillings and 2p he'd paid for the girls' education over the previous year. This figure was nearly half of his annual income. The settlement, though financial, was a poor consolation for the cost of Maria and Elizabeth's lives. The amount could not replace his beloved daughters, nor ease the grief that Patrick felt, a grief that remained with him throughout his life. Despite receiving the settlement, Patrick's sorrow remained overwhelming. His grief was private, shared only with the closest family members, and it profoundly affected his emotional state and his ability to move forward. Patrick continued to carry this deep sense of loss, both emotionally and spiritually, and the deaths of his daughters were a weight he could never fully bear. The death of Maria and Elizabeth left an incredible mark on Charlotte, not just emotionally, but in how she approached her future roles in the Bronte family. As the eldest surviving child, Charlotte quickly found herself thrust into a position of responsibility and emotional pressure. The loss of Maria in particular had a profound impact on her, especially as her father Patrick continually praised Martha's intellectual ability and her character. Patrick often referred to Maria as his favourite and described her as an exceptionally gifted child. Charlotte was aware of the constant praise, and it placed a significant weight on her shoulders. She felt the need to live up to Maria's example, to be as good, as accomplished and as beloved as Maria had been. In her heart, she knew she could never replace her sister. The expectations placed on her were overwhelming. Charlotte herself later reflected on this immense pressure, writing that after Maria's death, she felt as though half of her had been taken away. In her grief, Charlotte turned to writing as a way to process her emotions, and this is where Maria's legacy lived on. In Jane Eyre, she created the character of Helen Burns, a young girl like Maria, suffered patiently and nobly under harsh conditions. Helen's character, who bears the brutality of Lowood School without complaint, is a direct reflection on how Charlotte viewed Maria's own suffering at Cowan Bridge. Helen's death in the novel, though not identical to Maria, mirrored the ultimate passing of her sister, and Charlotte poured her own sorrow into this fictional version of Maria's memory. Charlotte's portrayal of Helen Burns can be seen as a tribute to her sister's goodness, as well as to the idea that Patrick has set for Maria. Helen's selflessness, her resilience and her suffering all echo the qualities Charlotte admired in Maria. Through Helen Burns, Charlotte was able to express a kind of grief, a mourning of the loss of her sister, and also a tribute to the idolised memory of Maria that continued to influence her. While Charlotte didn't explicitly acknowledge it at the time, Maria's virtue, as constantly emphasised by Patrick, lived on through Helen Burns. Charlotte's way of coping with the loss and the expectation she somehow needed to fill the void left by her sister's death. And this emotional weight influenced much of Charlotte's later writing, where themes of duty, sacrifice and unbearable weight of loss become reoccurring subjects, particularly in works like Jane Eyre and Shirley. In creating Helen Burns, Charlotte bridged the gap between her own reality and the fictional world, embedding Maria's spirit into the stories while simultaneously grappling with the expectations of being the surviving Brontë sister, constantly striving to live up to the memory that was both a comfort and a burden. The lives of Maria and Elizabeth Brontë were marked by promise, intelligence and untimely death. Their influence on the Brontë family and their legacy in the world of literature cannot be overstated. Though they didn't live long enough to make their own marks in history, their impact on their surviving siblings, especially Charlotte, Emily and Anne, is clear. Reflecting on their story, it's impossible not to consider the immense grief their father Patrick must have experienced. Having already lost his wife, he was then faced with the death of two of his children. One can only imagine the sense of guilt he must have felt, especially knowing that he had sent them to that school where the conditions contributed to their ill health. A parent should never have to endure the death of their own child, let alone two, in such a short space of time. The loss must have been profoundly heartbreaking. The Brontë children, especially Charlotte, would have felt loss in the wake of such tragedy. The home they once knew, filled with the promise of youthful potential, must have become a place of deep sorrow and mourning. And as we look at the powerful work that Charlotte, Emily and Anne went on to create, we cannot help but wonder, would we have the Bronte novels we know and love today if the family had not been shaped by the loss of Maria and Elizabeth? The pain they endured clearly had a lasting impact on their writing, shaping this emotional depth and themes of grief, loss and resilience that continue to resonate in their work. Let me just get my clothes sorted because it's a bit chilly. Oh, chilly bench. I'll get my coat. Sit on my coat properly. That's better. That sun is beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it's still cold. Ooh, my hands are cold. Sun's come out and I can see. I might sit on my carrier bag because that adds a little bit of insulation, as long as I don't crackle. Thank you for watching today. This video, I must admit, has been a bit of a challenge to research because there is so little information about Maria and Elizabeth out there, and of course hardly any belongings or personal items to shed light on their lives. I hope you've learned more about these two important figures and of course the significant role that they played in the Bronte family. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think would have happened if Maria and Elizabeth had lived longer? Do you think they'd have written novels? Do you believe their deaths shaped the way the Brontë sisters wrote? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. That would be brilliant. So, as I say each week, please do the whole likey, subscribey thing because it really does help me out and it lets YouTube know that we want to watch more Bronte content. I'm going to head home for a cup of tea and to warm up because it's gone quite cloudy and chilly now. But I will see you all next Friday for more Bronte adventures. Take care. Bye.